In March of 1930, a frail 61-year-old man leaned on his walking stick, stepped out of his ashram in western India, and started walking. He had just 78 followers with him and a brutal 241-mile journey ahead. 24 days later, they reached the coastal village of Dandi. The old man walked down to the edge of the Arabian Sea, reached into the wet sand, and scooped up a handful of muddy, salt-crusted earth. With that single scoop of mud, he broke the law, specifically the British Empire's Salt Act, a strict statute that made it completely illegal for any Indian to collect or produce their own salt. This march was a precise, calculated rollout of civil disobedience. The strategy was demanding: intentionally break an unjust law, peacefully, in broad daylight, and accept the punishment without fighting back. The choice to target salt was highly strategic. Salt is a biological requirement for human survival. Every single person needs it. By holding a strict monopoly on its production, the British forced an entire subcontinent to buy heavily taxed imported salt, a daily, unavoidable financial burden on the absolute poorest citizens. Before taking a single step, Gandhi had actually offered a diplomatic way out. He sent an explicit list of 11 demands to the British Viceroy, Lord Irwin, including a plea to abolish the salt tax. Irwin didn't even bother to write back. By dismissing those demands with absolute silence, the colonial government laid the groundwork for its own humiliation. They turned an everyday mineral on the dinner table into the exact tool that would dismantle their authority. When the march finally began on March 12th, the physical toll was immediate. Walking 10 miles a day through the blistering heat of Gujarat is punishing work, especially for an isolated group of 78 walkers seemingly swallowed up by the massive Indian landscape. But the isolation didn't last. As they passed through rural villages, locals lined the dirt roads to shower them with flowers and blessings. Young men fell in line behind the original marchers. Within 3 weeks, that fragile band of 78 had swelled into an unbroken procession of thousands. The international press watched closely. Reporters from America, Britain, and France wired dispatches back home, fascinated by the stark visual of an elderly man methodically walking to challenge a heavily armed global superpower. On the morning of April 6th, they finally reached the shores of Dandi. Before doing anything else, the massive crowd gathered for silent morning prayers, reinforcing the strict, non-violent discipline required for what they were about to do. Then, Gandhi steps toward the water, lifted the salty mud, and made a simple public declaration that he had broken British law. That highly publicized, incredibly simple act broke the psychological spell of colonial rule. By openly demonstrating that the law could be ignored without immediate lightning striking them down, Gandhi gave an entire nation permission to step out of line. The response was explosive. Up and down the coastlines, along riverbanks, and over cooking fires in millions of private homes, ordinary Indian citizens started boiling seawater and manufacturing their own illegal salt. The British administration was caught entirely off guard. Initially, government officials had openly mocked the idea that a handful of dust could threaten an empire. But as the defiance decentralized and spread to every corner of the country, that mockery quickly turned into administrative panic. Desperate to regain control, the state deployed its standard blunt instrument. On the night of May 5th, armed officers arrested Gandhi in his sleep, locking him away without formal charges or a trial. But the colonial government severely miscalculated. Cutting off the head of the movement did absolutely nothing to stop the momentum. Instead, it guaranteed a massive, highly disciplined confrontation at a government facility called the Dharasana Salt Works. By jailing Gandhi only to watch the protests accelerate, the British saw the reality of the situation. The movement had evolved past a single charismatic leader into a self-sustaining, widespread national awakening. On May 21, 1930, 2,500 protesters marched directly toward the barbed wire and armed guards of the Dharasana factory. As the front line approached the perimeter, the police charged. Officers swung heavy, steel-tipped wooden lathis directly into the crowds. The protesters absorbed the blows without raising a single arm to defend themselves. American journalist Webb Miller stood feet away, watching the carnage unfold. He later wrote, "I have never seen anything like it. They are beaten, they fall, they rise. Then they move forward, without raising a hand. That specific dispatch was telegraphed across the globe and published in over 1,000 newspapers. When the world read about heavily armed imperial forces bludgeoning unarmed, peaceful civilians, the British Empire permanently lost its claim to moral superiority. The political pressure became unbearable, with over 60,000 Indians sitting in jail and the colonial economy grinding to a halt. Viceroy Irwin was forced to the negotiating table. He signed a pact that released the political prisoners and formally granted coastal residents the right to produce their own salt. This successful application of truth force, or Satyagraha, echoed far beyond the 1930s. Decades later, a young preacher in America would study these exact tactics to organize the Montgomery bus boycott and the broader civil rights movement. The same blueprint of disciplined, nonviolent resistance would later be utilized thousands of miles away in South Africa to dismantle the machinery of apartheid. The Salt March exposed the ultimate vulnerability of physical force. It proved that a government's authority evaporates the moment its citizens lose their fear, and that an empire heavily armed with guns and laws can ultimately be fractured